I'm with Fiona McIntosh, who spent her entire career at the BBC in music. Starting off as a violinist in Scotland, Fiona, so I can take you back to those years. How did your interest in music start?
Well, my mum was a piano player and I always wanted to play the piano, and I did up to a point, and then they came around the school and said anyone want to play the violin. So I started learning that, and I had a fantastic music department at the school because it was in the good old days when we had lots of peripatetic teachers and all instruments and a very inspiring head of music, and it just blossomed from there. Youth orchestra, wanted to go to college, went to college. Back in those days, didn't quite know why or what you were going to do at the end of it. And then I had a pretty successful freelance career. I went to the Scottish Academy for 3 years and then Guildhall School of Music for a year in London, and then freelanced for about 9 years after that.
So at what point so how old would you be when you started playing the violin?
I was still at primary school, so probably about 10 or 11.
Now, I played the piano and I enjoyed playing the piano. I also played the violin very badly at school and never really took to it. So, but can you think of a moment where you thought, this is I really enjoy doing this?
That's a difficult one. I did really enjoy it. I mean, I was a kid. You don't really want to practice, but I enjoyed playing. I enjoyed the youth orchestra was inspiring, and eventually it's all your friends that you have are doing music as well. And because it was a good school for music, because we're talking about this late 60s, early 70s, I mean, there was money spent on education at that time, and the arts, and you could specialise in music, art, sport. It was fantastic. So I think because I was surrounded, my friends were all musicians as well, and we'd trundle off on a Saturday morning from school. We took the train from Fife through to Glasgow to just have lessons and do youth orchestra at the Scottish Academy. This is junior school. So that kind of the stepping stone into going in full time. So that's how, it was just... I didn't really want to do anything else, I don't think.
And all classical works? Did you do any other kind of playing?
No, I played a little bit of fiddle music, but not fiddle music like they do now. It was just playing tunes. So it was all classical, yeah.
So at what point did the BBC come knocking, or did you go knocking on the BBC door?
Nobody knocks on your door as a musician. No, you've got to... as I said, I freelanced for 9 years and I enjoyed that, but you sort of want a little bit of stability. And so I started auditioning for full-time jobs, and I was lucky to get a trial. Now, before this, the way orchestras work, there's a lot of freelance work with vacancies and people being sick. So I had been going into the BBC Scottish as a freelancer for a few years. I then applied and got a trial, which is another story about how to get into an orchestra, and eventually got a job there. So I was in the BBC Scottish from 1985 until 1990. So it was 5 years.
Playing what sort of things?
Oh, well... The repertoire back then, well, very typically, with the 5 BBC orchestras and the BBC singers are the full-time orchestras the BBC run. And, we're not there to put bums on seats, really. It was about pushing music out, experimenting. We didn't really go out the studio a lot back in those days. It was recorded for Radio 3, push the boundaries, new music. But we did go out. We did do a concert series at the City Hall, and we did tour. But the BBC was never like the Arts Council orchestras, the RSNO or the Halley here. They really are commercial. They have to do popular programmes. BBC still does it. They always, have interesting programmes that, might not get so many people in the concert hall, but... it's good. So we did a lot of contemporary music. We did a lot of studio recordings and not so many concerts. It's balanced out now. They do more public concerts. But it was quite tough. You would go through a lot of repertoire. You'd get through maybe 10, 12 pieces of music a week, and have to be on the ball. Red light goes on, recording. Studio concerts with members of the public, in which the studio back in the old BBC in Scotland held about 200 people, And that was, if you listen to Radio 3, they still do studio concerts, from all their studios. So, yeah, and it was all classical, modern to traditional. You went in, if you couldn't sight read when you went in, you could sight read when you left, because there was so much repertoire, so much music to learn, that you got quite fast at reading the music in front of you. British orchestras are the best in the world for sight reading, because there's not enough money in the arts to allow a lot of rehearsal time. So you literally may just have 2 sessions, which would be 6 hours to learn a whole programme. It depends what it is, who it is and things, but it can be pretty demanding. Whereas back then in Germany, an orchestra would spend a week rehearsing one programme. So foreign conductors would come and always be surprised that we could actually put the music in front of us and play it. Unfortunately, I'm not that good anymore.
I remember, because I spent a lot of my time in news in Manchester, where the BBC Philharmonic was based, of course, and we'll come on to that later, because you subsequently went on to work at the Philharmonic. And I remember seeing musicians outside the studio rehearsing and before a recording, and talking to a few of them, saying how stressful it could be, if you're the person that gets it wrong, and the whole recording has to be done again. Did you feel that pressure from the beginning?
You do. It's far more pressure. I mean, it's what you do, so there is pressure, but not like it's the first time you're doing it. It's not. You have to feel a little bit of tension to sit there and give your best. But I mean, especially in BBC orchestras, you get one chance at it. You're not going to repeat that programme 3 times that week and have another go. And also, it's being recorded. It's going out to the world back then. But at the same time, if it was a recording, they could do retakes. And of course, there was always retakes. We used to do retakes in the studio concerts, and the producer would come out and tell the audience we're going to run a piece from this part and that. Nowadays, they tend not to do that so much. I think they try to make it as live how it would have been for the audience. But then, and if it's just a studio recording, there's lots of retakes, just to make sure it's as good as it can get. Not to the extent of a commercial recording. That is very, very fussy. So when you buy your CD, there'll be an awful lot of edits to make it all perfect.
Right. I would imagine lots of people don't know that. They kind of imagine it's live, but thinking about it, obviously not.
Well, it depends. You've got to see it these days. You've got to see. Back then, I think they got away with editing more than you could do now, because now, I can't remember when it changed, quite a few years ago now, if you did a concert in the Bridgewater Hall, for example, and say one of the players split a note or something, you had to put it out. When you put it out 3 days later on Radio 3, you would have to put it out with that split. In previous to those days, you could probably fix that little odd note from a previous the rehearsal or something like that, and you can't do that anymore. So there's a less need to edit, because we have to be quite honest about that was the recording that the people in the studio listened to. But it's just for the studio, and it's a red light. The producer's got control. He'll say, I want to do that bit again, and he can patch it all together.
Was this in Glasgow you were recording?
Well, in Glasgow, and then subsequently in the BBC Phil, but of course I was in management in the BBC Phil, but as a player, the pressure's there. I was a rank and file violinist, so you're in a group of, back then it was 12 first violins. Now, if you're first trumpet or first oboe, the pressure is really on, because you get one go and you've got to get it right. It's not many jobs you have one chance at getting it right. If you're going to write a report, you can revise it, you can look at it again, you can make sure it's right, you can read it to your friends. When you go in an orchestra and you've got a concert or recording, the red light's on, that's it, you've got to get it right. So people do strive for perfection in an orchestra. I'd say more so than, probably sports people as well, but and the arts. But it is pressured, but there's a satisfaction as well at the end of it. You get it right and you've done a good job and it sounds great, then is that pressure? I don't know. Depends how difficult the piece is. Some pieces would be definitely pressure.
But by that time you'd already been playing for other orchestras. Was there anything Was there a special feeling about working for a BBC orchestra for you?
Yeah, the BBC orchestras, well, as I've explained, because they did recordings, they did a lot more repertoire. So the other orchestras, symphony orchestras, would maybe do one programme a week, and the BBC would do 3. So you were never bored, put it that way. You never got bored because it was new music on your stand, and they became good at that aspect of it. If I'm being highly critical, I'd say it was never as polished as maybe the Scottish National Orchestra or the Halley would have been back then. I'm talking about, because it's slightly different now across the board, but because they had the time to make it very polished. People used to come to BBC concerts and say the orchestra seems much more lively and, edge of the seat stuff, and that's probably because that's the lack of rehearsal, and it gave a kind of vibrancy to it as well. It was also, back then, because there was less public concerts, it was more of a 9 to 5 job, except orchestras start at 10. Nobody starts at 9 in the music world, because you're quite often working evenings, so it's a 10 o'clock start. So it suited a lot of people because it was during the day more often than the evening. All the other orchestras worked Thursday, Friday, Saturday evenings, and we wouldn't. So it was different. The job's the same, but the repertoire different, and just your approach to it, I think.
Where would you put a BBC orchestra? A difficult question, but compared to other, you mentioned some other orchestras. Was the BBC up there with the best?
Oh, in standards?
Yes.
Now, absolutely, yes. Back then, I would say the BBC orchestras weren't back then because of the nature of, they were studio bands, basically. So to give a bit of background as well, in 1980 there was a big strike with the orchestras, BBC orchestras. They had 11 orchestras, and the BBC decided to axe all the radio orchestras, and all the musicians went on strike over the proms, and I think it was about 3 months. I was just finishing college then, so I wasn't quite part of it, but we knew about it. And they lost a lot of musicians because a lot of the ones near retirement just thought, I'm going to lose my job anyway, and left. So the BBC Scottish had probably 60% of the players instead of 100%. And so they kind of had to build themselves up again. I wouldn't say it's so much that there's a better standard with the other orchestras. I mean, some of the London orchestras are fantastic back then, and we wouldn't be able to patch them. But the standard of musicians these days is so high that there's none of the British orchestras that I could really pit against each other. They're just really remarkable. And I mean, in a different league from when I played, it really is. There's just so many good musicians around. You only have to see Young Musician of the Year, and it's gobsmacking what a 12-year-old can do these days,
So you're still playing at this point, but then you've got to move from Scotland and move into management.
Yes, I'd always been one of these annoying people that was on committees and sticking my nose in and trying to sort things. But I did run a little chamber orchestra just with some players, and I liked doing that sort of thing. And I ran the Friends organisation of the orchestra. So. And I just thought, I don't know that I want to be sitting in a violin section when I'm 60. And I really enjoyed playing, but there was quite a lot of older members of the orchestra who were quite cynical. And I think looking at them, I thought, I don't want to end up like that. And it's very easy because it's a strange profession. There's very little growth within your profession. In a violin world, there's 12 of you in the section, and the people up the front are probably that good when they leave college. And if you're a rank and file player, that's what you were going to be. Well, there's nowhere to grow. And I thought, no, in my head I wanted more. So I actually started going to the Open University. In the middle of that, just to do something for my brain, in the middle of that, this job came up in the Ulster Orchestra for orchestra manager, and which was in those days the fixer, which is different. There's a different sort of hierarchy, and I thought I would give it a go, and lo and behold, I got it. So that was a bit of a shock.
So move over to Belfast. Was
yes,
that then?
yeah, in 1990. So it was interesting because I didn't think I'd get it, and then I got it, and then I was dead excited. And so I gave up playing the violin, which was a very scary thing to do because that's all I could do. That, I wasn't trained to be anything else, while I still really enjoyed it. And I think that was quite a good thing, actually, because I had I had a good relationship with musicians after that, because I wasn't thinking, I'm glad I'm not doing that. I was sort of still jealous of them doing that and playing for a living.
So for those of us who don't know, what does a fixer do?
The fixer basically works with the players all the time, and if somebody's sick, they've got to fix another musician to come in to cover them. Plus, if it's a small orchestra like the Ulster and the BBC actually, they only carry 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, and a lot of repertoire needs 3 or 4. So you have to fix and book the other players. So you're basically booking people. And
so you're in a part of the world that you don't know well, and you're having to find players you might not have met before.
No, you just have lists, and each of the section principals tell you who they want. So until you get to know it. But actually in Belfast, because this is during the Troubles, most of the freelancers came from London. We had to fly them over. So I was also a travel agent, because we did so many flights that I actually used to write the flight tickets out in the office, send it to the players. Unless it was very late and you'd do it by phone, because this was before we did have fax machines, but we didn't have a computer when I started. I don't think. Did have one when I left, but
you mentioned the Troubles there. Did they cause you any particular difficulties with the orchestra?
No, they'd been through some tough times earlier, but by the time I got to know them, I'd actually worked with them as a freelancer, so I did have some idea of what it was like. I mean, you were living in a bit of a war zone, which was an adjustment you make, getting your bag checked every time you walk into a shop and all this sort of stuff. That becomes normal, which is a bit sad, but it becomes normal. As far as the orchestra was concerned, we were fine. I mean, we weren't going to be targeted. It was very specific, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which is another discussion, I'm sure. But it was... No, they were a great bunch, and I think, though, it makes people friendlier because they were so nice and accommodating, and they understood if somebody was going to be late because they couldn't get a flight because you'd only phoned them up at 11 o'clock the night before, and it was pretty relaxed, really.
And was it a similar kind of programme, more recording work, or were you touring?
It was a mixture. They didn't do so many recordings. They did a whole BBC season, which was in the summer. The whole of August was all work for the BBC, so that became like a recording orchestra. The rest of the time they were doing their Friday night concerts in Belfast, and they would go to Derry once a month and Enniskillen once a month or whatever. So just touring about. So
an audience in Belfast, is it the same as an audience in Scotland or Manchester, or is it different?
Do you know, that's a good question. We got good audiences in Northern Ireland because they were the only orchestra. In Glasgow, you're competing with, there's 3 orchestras. Well, the chamber orchestra's Edinburgh, but so in Manchester you're competing, and it's a big concert hall. But interestingly enough, in Belfast, they tend to do their concerts in the old Ulster Hall now, not in the new concert hall because they can't fill it. So that's now. I don't know. They were very welcoming. The Northern Irish people are just delightful. So, it was very enthusiastic.
And were you missing playing at all?
A little bit. Only when it was nice repertoire. I used to wish I was on stage, but no, I was too busy. Absolutely. Oh, I had a bit of a baptism of fire at the Ulster Orchestra as well, because I'd been there for 3 months. And the deputy general manager left. She'd got another job. And then the general manager, which was back then the chief executive, he left, head of marketing left, and it was quite a small team, and it ended up with the head of accounts and me and the assistant in the orchestra running the orchestra for about 3 months. So I went from being a violinist to running the whole orchestra in 3 months, and with great support from the board and things like that, but it was a baptism of fire. You kind of had to get on with it. So it was actually, when I look back, I learned an awful lot then. I wasn't just fixer, I was doing everything until they appointed people, which took a little while. But again, the people over there, they're just so fantastic, and we definitely were supported, So.
And what about the technology? Was that changing? Was the recording becoming slicker,
Ooh.
more digital and all the rest of things?
I have no idea. I didn't back then. I don't know that I ever really went into the cubicle much. I was just, when I was a violinist, I just left. That was these people in the box there. In fact, even once I was in the BBC Phil, I kind of understood what was going on, but I remember them getting a new digital desk. So that was after I joined them. So it was probably still all back analogy back then. I can't remember. I don't know.
So then another move for you to Manchester next?
Yes. So right? Then I applied for the orchestra manager job.
Is this a bigger orchestra?
Much bigger orchestra, and although the title orchestra manager was the same as what I had in a BBC orchestra, I wasn't fixing. I was running the whole department, so it sort of jumps a whole level because you don't have a chief executive in the BBC. You're a department. So there was the head of the orchestra, and then there was me, and then I would have what they actually called a fixer back then.
So for people who don't know where we are, so we're now at Oxford Road.
That's right.
Headquarters in Manchester. Just describe for people listening the setup from your point of view with the studio and rehearsal.
Right. Well, it was built. When was it built? The 60s, early 70s. And they had a studio built for them. So it was a proper orchestral studio. It was a big studio. It wasn't great acoustically because I don't think they had the knowledge when they built it to make it brilliant, but we definitely had the space. But for anyone who'd ever been to Oxford Road, it was a kind of sad building. It was a bit miserable, but the studio itself was fine. We had nice facilities. We didn't have big rooms for the orchestra. We didn't have locker rooms. I mean, nowadays they expect lockers and things, but the unfortunate thing was the offices were split on different levels around the studio, so it wasn't quite so compact as a unit. But we did have studios next door to the TV studios and things, and that meant you knew you were in a BBC building, which was nice because it's very easy for orchestras to be separate and just be the orchestra. And we were very much part of BBC North. In fact, we were under the umbrella of BBC North when I started. We've changed departments many times, but it was BBC North at the time.
And did that feel different for you?
It was all new to me when I went, because I'd not been in the management side. So actually as a player you tend not to notice any changes. It doesn't matter who's running the umbrella department. And since people listen to this will be BBC, they'll understand what I mean about that, because things change and called different things. But as a player it doesn't matter, you just go and play the violin. You're not having to deal with somebody saying you got to use this headed paper or that headed paper. You just turn up. As management it mattered, and so you'd go to a lot of meetings about managing it, the structure of things, how you fit it into the bigger picture. And then we became classical music radio. Was it just classical music or was it Radio 3 classical music? Came a new department. So all the orchestras came under that.
You've also, of course, got the famous Halle Orchestra in Manchester. Was there an element of competition between you?
I don't think there's any competition, really. There's probably a healthy competition, actually. I mean, you'll get the people will be saying, oh, the Halle have done this, and oh, the BBC have done that, or whatever. But they worked together. They used to have clash meetings, so I wasn't part of that because I wasn't the programming side of things, but they would meet and to make sure that, 1 week the Halle weren't doing Mahler 5, and then the following week the BBC Phil were doing Mahler 5. So, no, there was a healthy kind of agreement that we've all got to work together. And they had a very different audience. The Halle got a very traditional audience. Ours was much, much younger. Explained by the bar staff in the Bridgewater Hall when not long after it had opened, and one of the bar staff said to me, oh, we can tell it's the BBC Phil because people drink gin and tonics at the BBC Phil concerts and they drink cups of tea at the Halle. They didn't even open the bars for the Halle concert on certain levels of the Bridgewater because the age dynamic and that they wanted cups of tea at the interval.
And that's purely the choice of music then, is it?
Yeah, I'm sure maybe some of the young ones went to the Halle as well, but the Halle go back years of people, busloads came in from Preston and things to go to the Halle concerts. It was what people buy subscriptions, and it's what they do. You know, I don't think it mattered what the repertoire. They bought a season ticket and they would go along to the Halley. The BBC Phil, because it's a much shorter season, because we didn't do concerts every week, people would choose to come to that concert. And so you just get a different dynamic. There's just less grey hair at our concerts, I think, you know. And I'm not saying you wouldn't get people with grey hair, but there's a definite willingness to try something out with our audiences.
What was a change for you was a lot more touring to some quite exotic places this time. Can you tell me about some of those?
Oh, right. Well, we did about probably averaged out about 2 tours a year, but some years it was before and some years it would be one. And that was my job, to organise all the tours. We've been everywhere. I mean, the classic one, most orchestras do Germany once every 3 years, so we've all been to Germany many times. But further afield, I've been to Japan 4 times, done China, Oman. Oman was my first trip with the BBC Phil. I just joined and we went to Oman because the Sultan of Oman was 25 years in office and wanted an orchestra from Britain as a present from the government, I assume, or the British Council or something. And we were sent out over New Year to play him a concert. And so we did, and he was an hour and a half late in arriving. The whole orchestra was sitting on stage for an hour and a half, waiting for the Sultan to arrive. And the audience were all sitting there as well. Anyway, he arrived, he got his concert. So that was the first one.
What about China?
China weekend, we did New Year, funnily enough, the year after the Olympics, because we were meant to play in 3 concerts in Beijing and in the Great Hall of the People. And then the month before, they told us that we couldn't do the 3rd concert in the Great Hall of the People because somebody needed it. And so, okay, that's fine. So, and they said, but we've arranged for you to play. We're going to play in the Nest. And we're going, but that's a swimming pool. Oh yes, don't worry. You know, we build a platform over the end of the swimming pool. Well, I mean, everybody's seen Olympic swimming pools. They're acoustically a nightmare because they're just a great big tin box. I mean, I know it looked like a nest on the outside, but it was. So I was thinking health and safety, all this sort of stuff, and of course
the nest. Tell me about
so, anyway, we were doing a traditional concert of Tchaikovsky's 4th Symphony and something like that. We had no time because the schedule's quite tight doing other things to rehearse a different programme, but they wanted, in the swimming pool, they wanted a light-hearted programme because acoustically it was never going to be, but we couldn't really give them a light-hearted programme. So, and it turns out, so if you imagine you've got the Olympic pool and at the other end there's a diving pool, the platform was built over the diving pool, so the Olympic pool is still in front of us. You couldn't make it up, could you? Right, so the conductor's got his back to the swimming pool, and what they wanted to do was do water fountain display while we played, and it doesn't really go with Sykes Symphony, you know. So we said we can't really do that, but because of the repertoire, they said, well, you know, we said we'll give you an encore. And we did something like Radetzky March or something like that and everything. Well, I've never laughed so much because there were fountains and lights going the whole way right down the pool. And all the audience, it was the highlight of their night. The concert was just, as soon as the fountains came on, they were loving it. But you couldn't hear anything. I mean, it was just a big bathroom. I mean, it was the most bizarre thing I've ever done, I think, was sorting that out. And, you know, I mean, the percussionists had a sort of, the health and safety wise, you know, it was all done with scaffolding. And, you know, we checked, they weren't going to fall in, but, you know, it was the diving pool was right behind them, you know. So
on these tours, was the headache of instruments going missing and music going missing, were they your headaches?
Oh, they would have been my headaches, yes. Yeah, anything to do with, I mean, any of the logistics side. We have a big articulated truck, which takes all the instruments, I mean, bar the sort of hand-carried things. But, I mean, if you wanted your violin taken on the truck, it could go. We had big trunkers with slots for all the violins. So everything would go on the truck, and if it was flying, everything got put into flight I mean, the trunk is a flight case, but they would all go freight. Logistically, everything has to be weighed, measured and everything, but the stage managers, that's part of their job, and they do that. But basically, I'm the person who signs it off, so if it all went squidly.
I guess some of the instruments really valuable, really.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's millions of pounds worth of instruments in an orchestra. I mean, if you add them all up, so yeah, you only need one that's worth, nearly £1 million, and that's knocked your whole insurance budget up. But we have annual insurance for all the instruments.
Would most musicians would their instrument be their own instrument?
Yes, yeah. Some orchestras, the Halley own a violin that the leader uses. Somebody must have probably given it to them. I don't know if it's a Strad, but it's a good violin, and the leader will generally play on that. But the BBC orchestras, none of them have their own instruments, apart from the percussion. No, everybody has their own.
The other element of your fixing job was finding musicians at very short notice to play quite difficult parts.
Yeah.
How interesting and difficult was that?
Oh, that can be a bit of a nightmare. But you know how I was saying earlier that British orchestras are the best sight readers in the world, and they prove it time and time again when you have to people get booked at the last minute and they come in, and hopefully you get a bit of rehearsal, but there are times when it's actually on the day of the concert or between the rehearsal and the concert, and they've got to come in. No, they are remarkable actually. I mean, the standard of playing in this country is so good, but there's many stories of last minute bookings, and you get somebody. There's a guy I booked for very late at night in the Ulster Orchestra, and I can't remember, the trombone player had phoned up and something had happened. He'd fallen over and broke his hand or something, and we had a recording at 10 o'clock the next morning. So I'm on the phone at midnight to some trombone players in London to say, can you get here? Yeah, and can you get yourself to the airport for 6 o'clock in the morning to get a flight over to Belfast? So yeah, that's fine. And he arrived, great, opened his case, and half his trombone wasn't there because he'd forgotten he was practicing and he'd left it. So we managed to find a trombone, but it wasn't the one he wanted. I mean, he wasn't happy because it wasn't a trombone he wanted to play, but we got through it. But it's things like that that makes it.
You touched on something because obviously musicians are artists, and artists can be tricky to look after. Were they easy people to look after?
Well, the orchestra tend to look after themselves. I mean, you are their line manager, so they come on a daily basis. They're in with issues, but once they're playing, it's not the playing stuff I was dealing with. I was dealing with the personal stuff or the HR type stuff, but I did have to look after the soloists and the conductors, and that varies from trickiness to
arguments, tears, strops.
Not many of those, but back in the old days, quite a few prima donnas. I had one soloist who wouldn't, back in the old days, the Free Trade Hall and the Midland Hotel. I mean, 50 yards? Wouldn't walk. And we tried to explain to that it was a one-way system and it would take the car 10, 15 minutes to go around the block because it was always terrible traffic around there to get into... No, she refused. She would not walk 50 yards. And it's that sort of thing, you just have to go with it. You just think, oh, for goodness sake, but it is what it is. And people who want particular things in their dressing room, which doesn't happen very often. I've heard of some classical musicians who, I won't name names, who insist on a particular type of mineral water and a particular kind of air conditioner in his room, and you just think, it's everybody else manages. You'll get your mineral water. It just might not be that make, But no, there's many stories of conductors and soloists, little things, but most of the time, you have to. It's very stressful for them as well, and you just want to make things as comfortable as possible. So you look after them, and I think the BBC is particularly good at looking after their soloists and conductors because it's not. BBC studios are not the most comfortable places to go. It's not a glamorous concert hall. They come and work in these conditions, but probably the same across the world. If you're in a recording studio in New York, it probably looks just like a BBC recording studio. They can be fussy. The Russians, it goes with nationalities as well. Russians are, if they don't speak the language, very difficult to communicate with. in the sense that they just do their own thing, and you're blue in the face till you say, no, we actually want you to stand here. If they don't want to stand there on the stage, they won't, and it's not just a language thing, there's enough usually there, but that's just a bunch of them. The Europeans are all fine. Funnily enough, the more famous they are, the nicer they become. A lot of the prima donnas are the ones who are not as good as the really top end soloists. I don't know if that's the same in acting and things, but some of the really top end ones are delightful,
So you you've left the orchestra now, but did you carry on in that role right until the point you left?
More or less. I was orchestra manager, but the plan to move to Salford happened 6 years before I left, and they were building a new studio for us. So I ended up being orchestra and project manager, because there had to be one person who they kept coming to instead of asking various people. And so I worked with the designers and everything on the studio. Not me, just on my own, but I was the sort of liaison person, and that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that, actually, to try and get the best we could. And we did get fantastic, because I just thought, we've got to ask for everything, because they're bound to turn around and say you can't have everything. And well, they gave us everything at the beginning, so we did get nice offices and everything, which they've since lost because we couldn't afford to keep the rents up. Things have changed in the BBC. But we were in the studio block. If you know Salford, there's three BBC buildings and the studio block, which is Peel, multi-use studios. The BBC Philharmonic studio, which is bespoke for them, with great risers, everything, acoustically designed, all this sort of thing, with flaps that change and everything like that. It's not in a BBC building. But we wanted our offices next to the studio. So that was a bit of a negotiation. So we got them, but of course, eventually all this lovely office space that we had was required by somebody else. So it got squashed down. It's fine. We all do open plan offices now, and we all do, what do you call it? Hot desking. Hot desking. Yeah. And that was only just coming in. So although we were open plan in the new layout, the hot desking, people were very funny about it to begin with. I mean, now they wouldn't bat an eyelid, but then you wanted your own desk and your things around you. So we got it was great. They got everything. Not everything. There's always issues of things, but we were the first people into Salford, because the studio block was finished before the BBC buildings. So they moved the orchestra in, and there was no canteen, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. But the car park was empty, so that was really good.
For those who don't know, Salford Quays and Media City now, it's quite a vibrant place now, isn't it? It's
Absolutely.
Very busy, lots of television, lots of radio made there. And is the orchestra happy there, do you think?
I think so. I mean, they've got much better facilities, and the studio's much nicer. Yeah, the environment is much more pleasant. I mean, just the air conditioning in the old building was terrible. You'd either hot or cold, and all that sort of thing it works now. There's always things you might say, I wish this was better, but if you look back to what it was like in Oxford Road, it's a big, big improvement. It was just very weird when we moved in, it was just the orchestra, and they opened the canteen at the top of one of the BBC buildings, the one with the canteen, I can't remember which one it is.
Key House. There
was nothing else happening in that building. And you just took the lift up, and they had this sort of two little ladies serving sandwiches just because we were there. So, and now, it's absolutely thriving, and it's a great place, actually. Yeah.
So finally, looking back on a long and varied career, and we're talking in the BBC centenary year, how secure and safe would you say the BBC's orchestras are?
Oh, I really hope they are, because basically they work for radio, and even the fact there's 5 BBC orchestras. There's the Scottish, the Welsh, Symphony Orchestra in London, the Concert Orchestra in London, and the Philharmonic in Manchester, and the BBC Singers. And their entire budget is diddly squat compared with some of the TV budgets. And yet, people, say, should we be spending that? And it's a sort of, it's very difficult balance, because they still really push the boat out and and now we're taking music out to people. I mean, it's much more, they've got outreach programs, all these things are happening. That never happened in the old days,
So just finally, how important would you say the orchestra's done that outreach work is to the nation, if you like?
Oh, I think it's absolutely vital. I mean, the culture in this country, it's been cut, and I think the BBC, hopefully, which will survive another 100 years, really has to be at the forefront of it, because a lot of the independent ones might not. We've just seen this week in English National Opera. Will they survive? Will Opera North survive if they move up here? I don't know. But interesting enough, they've just created a department. They've a new umbrella. It's not starting yet in January. BBC Orchestras and Choirs. I don't know. Is that a good thing? I hope it is, because it's a unit. They're not just coming under BBC North or BBC Radio 3. There's a whole unit. So I'm hoping they've got a future. It would be a tough one.
We'll stop there, but that's an optimistic note to end on. So, okay. Fiona McIntosh, thanks very much for sharing your memories of the BBC with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.